My name is Ben. I'm pastor at Henderson Assembly of God. It's a privilege to be together today, and I am thankful for you, whether you're viewing in online or you're here in person today. Thankful for you and thankful that we have this moment together as a church family. Today is Palm Sunday. It's the day in which we remember Jesus going in and riding into Jerusalem as the long-awaited Messiah. And so that today is the day where we kind of commemorate that. We remember that. And so oddly enough, we're actually going to be in Joshua, where we've been journeying together as a family, church family. And we're going to kind of bring the story and Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem together. And some of you are like, this is going to be good. I don't know if I'd say that, but we're going to try to piece those two things together because I do feel like there's a strong correlation. And before we jump in, the book of Joshua is an incredible account of God's people stepping into what God had already said He would give them. But they didn't do it the first time. But Joshua is the account of the second attempt and God's people actually stepping into their inheritance. And so that is maybe a good summary of its book. And as we left last week, we were basically in chapters ending chapter 12 and beginning chapter 13. And we kind of alluded to this division, not division as in like people not getting along, but there is land available, and they've got to figure out how that land gets to each tribe. And so we alluded to that. Today we're going to be kind of leaning in. But we're not going to be walking through chapters 13 through 21 in their entirety, because that is in essence the account of each tribe getting this allotment of land as a part of their as each tribe's inheritance. To set you at ease, we're not going to be going through however many chapters that is. I don't know what that is, 8 chapters. We're not going to be reading through 8 chapters today, but we're going to be kind of taking snapshots throughout these passages, and I do encourage you to read them. But we're going to lean into kind of a brief summary. We're going to lean into why there's 12 tribes and why do these tribes get land, and then how in the world does that have anything to do with Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey? I'm glad you asked. Let's wait for the answer. So, we're going to begin in chapter 13, beginning in verse 8. And it says, "The other half of Manasseh, the Reubenites and the Gadites, had received the inheritance that Moses had given them east of the Jordan, as he, the servant of the Lord, had assigned it to them." And so, the Jordan split kind of land that was east of the Jordan, and then obviously now what was left on the western side of the Jordan River. And the book of Joshua begins with the children of Israel crossing over Jordan miraculously. But they had actually conquered some land before crossing River Jordan. And so what verse 8 just told us is that there had already been 2.5 tribes that had received land from the eastern part, on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Or for you, as we're looking at the eastern side, the Jordan's here. There's 2.5 tribes that have received their inheritance from that area. And that's, in essence, the way that this listing of each tribe getting their inheritance is. They moved from the east of the Jordan, crossing the Jordan, and then into the western part of Canaan. They went to the central, did a campaign in the south, and then moved their efforts north. But nonetheless, that's kind of the Jordan River is kind of the dividing line in between east and west Canaan. 2.5 tribes on the east. That's what they just got done saying. So following the order of their conquest as they move east of the Jordan to the west, Joshua now moves to dividing the areas west of the Jordan, which is a larger area. to the remaining 9.5 tribes. And so we're going to pick back up in Joshua chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. Now these are the areas the Israelites received as an inheritance in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans of Israel allotted to them. Their inheritances were assigned by lot to the 9.5 tribes as the Lord had commanded through Moses. Moses had granted the 2.5 tribes their inheritance east of the Jordan, but had not granted the Levites an inheritance among the rest. For Joseph's descendants had become 2 tribes. And so, if you'll notice, there's no tribe called the tribe of Joseph. But Joseph was one of the 12 brothers. But actually, Joseph's tribe gets split into his 2 sons, and that's Ephraim and Manasseh. So when you hear about half of Manasseh getting part on the eastern side of the Jordan, and then there's a west Manasseh, Ephraim and Manasseh are Joseph's sons. And so you're like, well, that makes 13. Well, it does make 13 tribes, but God was very clear that the Levites would not get their own particular land that would be theirs, that they actually were the priests. And so the Lord was their inheritance. And we'll get into a little bit more of that as we continue to be reading through this. But they would be given cities in which they could have their families and their cattle in, but they didn't actually own land. And God meant for it to be that way. And so although there are now 13 with Joseph's 2 sons kind of entering this 12-tribe mix, Levites are out. The Lord was their inheritance. They were to serve the Lord and to serve the people as priests. And so we're back at 12, as weird as that may sound. And some of you are like, no, I need everything to fit in its nice little neat box. Well, I'm sorry, that's not how the Bible works. It's not super nice and neat and tidy. Sometimes it gets messy because that's what we are. But nonetheless, 13 kind of goes back to 12. Okay? Now, let's continue. Yeah, I believe we're at 4. For Joseph's descendants had become 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. The Levites received no share of the land, but only towns to live in with their pasture lands for flocks and herds. That's kind of what I said. Verse 5. So the Israelites divided the land, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So, there are many mentions of this about the Levites not receiving a portion of the land. And for a study into that, you can go back and look at, and we will kind of be alluding to a passage where the father of these 12 sons speaks a prophetic word over each of his sons. And because of what Simeon and Levi had done to the people of Shechem, and there were some horrible things that occurred, but instead of like seeking the Lord, they turned into the police, and they did some violent acts, and because of that, God, in essence, penalized Simeon and Levi. Simeon actually ended up getting land in Judah's area, and then Levi did not get land, but he was kind of in service to the Lord. That's kind of a cool inheritance. It's like, the Lord is your inheritance. Well, that's not a bad inheritance, but nonetheless, that's why those 2 didn't necessarily get like their own land, but nonetheless. The Levites, though, throughout these portions, these chapters of 13 through 21, it's like it's consistently said over and over again that the Levites don't get land. And it's like overstated. It's stated in 13:14. It's repeated in 13:33. I'm talking about chapter 13, verse 33. It's explained again in chapter 14, verse 4. It's recalled in chapter 18, verse 7. And you can go back to Deuteronomy 10:9, where God told Moses that this is the way it's going to be. And back in Numbers chapter 18, 21 through 24. In fact, let's read the Numbers section. Numbers chapter 18, verses 21 through 24 says, and this is God giving Moses at the time, his leader, because Numbers is back in time from where Joshua's setting is. But God's he's handing down how things are supposed to go to Moses, and then Moses hands it to Joshua. And so by the time we get into Joshua, Joshua knows what God said to Moses. But let's look back at what God said to Moses. Verse 21. I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel and their inheritance in return for the work they do while serving at the tent of meeting. From now on, the Israelites must not go near the tent of meeting, or they will bear the consequences of their sin and will die. It is the Levites who are to do the work at the tent of meeting and bear the responsibility for any offenses they commit against it. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. They will receive no inheritance among the Israelites. Instead, I give to the Levites as their inheritance the tithes that the Israelites present as an offering to the Lord. That's why I said concerning them, they have no inheritance among the Israelites. So, that's kind of the explanation as to why don't the Levites get this, and why is it consistently mentioned throughout Joshua? Because maybe someone reading is going, why isn't Levi getting what they had? And we're given that because God told Moses that's the way it would go. So the narrative shifts from the scene at Gilgal, where we've led up to in this point of the story of Joshua as a church family. It moves from this place called Gilgal to this tribal assembly, like this gathering of the tribes at a place called Shiloh, beginning in chapter 18, verse 1. Remember, we're kind of in the midst of all of this land being allotted and given to each tribe, and them figuring out what area actually belongs to our tribe. Verse 1 in chapter 18, Joshua 18 says, "The whole assembly of the Israelites gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under their control, but there were still 7 Israelite tribes who had not yet received their inheritance." Now, a couple of things to mention about those 2 verses we just read is that the tent of meeting was a symbol of the presence of God. And so, in the land of Canaan, or now into this land of promise, there would be 3 different places of worship, and now Shiloh would be considered one of those. But the tent of meeting was something that God had established with Moses, and the tent of meeting symbolized the presence of God. Like this tent served as God's home while the Israelites were in the wilderness. And that's kind of a weird thought for us, because we think about, well, isn't God omnipresent? Like, isn't he everywhere? It's like, yeah, he is everywhere. But if you've ever had the privilege of stepping into an area or a meeting, there's been times where I've stepped into church and all of a sudden it's like, so God's everywhere. Can't outrun him. It's kind of funny to read stories about Jonah trying to outrun God. Good luck. The earth and everything in it belongs to him. Like he's everywhere. But there's something to be said about the manifest presence of God. And if you've ever been in a meeting where he's been present, you will know the difference. Is that there's like not a visible cloud per se, but there is a manifestation of his presence. And so for them, again, the tent of meeting is the visual for them of, like, as they're through the wilderness, this was God's home. This is where his presence resided. And it's in the presence of God. Here at Shiloh, we have the whole assembly gathering together. And again, a visual example of unity, of coming together. At the end of this lengthy campaign, taking over a land. Verse 3 continues, "So Joshua said to the Israelites, 'How long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you?'" It's a good question. Verse 4, "Appoint 3 men from each tribe. I will send them out to make a survey of the land and to write a description of it according to the inheritance of each. Then they will return to me. You are to divide the land into 7 parts. Judah is to remain in its territory on the south, and the tribes of Joseph in their territory on the north. After you've written descriptions on the 7 parts of the land, bring them here to me, and I will cast lots for you in the presence of the Lord our God. The Levites, however, do not get a portion among you, because the priestly service of the Lord is their inheritance." Again, another nod to Levites don't get land. "And Gad, Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh have already received their inheritance on the eastern side of the Jordan. Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it to them. As the men started on their way to map out the land, Joshua instructed them, 'Go and make a survey of the land and write a description on it. Then return to me, and I will cast lots for you here at Shiloh in the presence of the Lord.'" So Joshua here, again, there are tribes that have yet to take the land. And so Joshua starts by asking a really interesting question. So God has given the land as an inheritance. And Joshua's question is, how long before you begin to take possession of it? And so this speaks to the double component that's necessary, is that God's given them the land already, but there's a them component. There's a tribal responsibility of possessing the land that's been given to them. They don't get to sit in the lazy boy and just watch their enemy walk in and hand over the rights. They've got to go in and get it. They've got to go possess it. They've got to step. God's done his part, and in essence, through his leader now, Joshua, he says, why haven't you done your part? Why haven't you done your part? It's a good question, and it's one that we should wrestle with in our walk with Jesus. And then we move to the end of the section of distribution in Joshua chapter 21, beginning in verse 43. And then it says, so the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to their ancestors, and that being Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through the generations. He passed down this promise. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. And so there's kind of an interesting reality at the end of these verses that we just read, because throughout passages, 17 through chapters 13 through 21, there's been mention of that tribes would step into their land, but not actually push the enemy out, not fully possess the land that God had given them. But then here we have statements that sound like they've walked in and they've in essence taken possession of the land. But we'll know, especially with future narratives, that they didn't fully possess, each tribe did not possess all that God had for them. But the author does make clear that although Israel is not faithful to complete their side of the deal, God is. He has delivered, as he has up to that point, as he has ever since, as he will continue from here forward. We're even here now in this place in time. And the distribution of land is completed with these final two verses. That God has gifted the land to the tribes. That it's his. He gets to give to whomever he wants because it belongs to him. And he comes good on the promise. So a summary reports that God has fulfilled these promises that he's made to Israel's ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now the people possess the land and live in it. And there is rest and victory over their enemies. Now, so where do the tribes of Israel come from? So to get back to the origin of these tribes, or the names of the tribes, or their genesis, go back to Jacob, the father of these 12 boys. And so Jacob has 12 sons. And so before all these boys come along, one evening Jacob wrestles with an angel of the Lord. A lot of passages will give as a heading for that section of Scripture in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob wrestles with God. And in this moment, all night long, until the sun's basically about to come up, Jacob's wrestling with a messenger of the Lord, wrestling with God, an angel. Lots of different interpretations on who Jacob was actually wrestling with, but there is no mystery as to where this messenger came from. But in this moment, he won't let this angel or being or whoever this was that Jacob is wrestling with until he blesses him. And God changes Jacob's name to Israel. And Jacob, meaning deceiver, and he certainly leaned into that name, is given a new name. And so he's called Israel. And so it's no, again, coincidence that the tribes of Israel are the names of his 12 sons. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's no tribe of Joseph. Joseph, 2 sons come in, and there's 13, but Levi actually receives no land. So that's kind of where it comes from. But at the end of Israel's or Jacob's life, he prophetically blesses each of his sons. And I encourage you to read that account. It's in Genesis chapter 49. It's an interesting thing. In their culture, even today, it's still this way. Like there is a culture of blessing that happens. And to be quite honest with you, I think that we should lean in a little bit more, especially as a Western people, to understand what actually happens there. I remember my mom at a point in my life where I think I was like Jacob. I was wrestling with God in my own way. And I remember my mom capturing this idea of that throughout the scriptures you see a parent speaking a word of blessing over their children. And so my mom, I think for a couple of years, would, like, at the beginning of the year, she'd speak a blessing over me. And it wasn't like, God, would you just bless them? It was like a detailed letter. And it was very specific. And as a child, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what to think about that. I didn't know if I liked that, because I didn't know what was in that letter until I got it. But I remember reading those words over me. And then I remember keeping the letter, and I remember going back and reviewing it either throughout the year or as that year had come to completion. And it was interesting to me. I'm not sure how it arrived at this point, if it was maybe she said it, and because she said it, I kind of leaned in. But some of the things she spoke over me that weren't in existence at that time were by the end of that year. Almost a prophetic word delivered and given, that she had been praying over me, and God had been putting scriptures on her heart about what this new year, this upcoming year, was to hold for me. And I remember reading that letter, and it was encouraging to me. It was encouraging to me, and it was something that I went back to. It's very common, and this was normal. But we see this even throughout the Old Testament scriptures especially, where parents, especially the fathers, would, before they go, speak a word of blessing over their sons. And this is that account in Genesis chapter 49. But I want to lean into one of those brothers' prophetic word that was of blessing that was spoken over them. Read all of them. Genesis 49. But I'm going to read about Judah. And this is Jacob, or also known as Israel, him speaking over his son Judah. And he says this in Genesis 49, verse 8 through 12. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub. Judah, you return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness who dares to rouse him. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs, other translations say, until Shiloh comes. And the obedience of the nations shall be his. That's key. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. So there's a lot of imagery there with what's being said. But there's some things to note. The scepter will not depart, the ruler's staff from between his feet. The nations, obedience of the nations shall be his. Stuff about a donkey or a colt. His garments in wine. And so it's clear from the blessing that Judah receives from his father that he's given the rights of the firstborn. And Judah was not the firstborn. It was Reuben. And thus, the blessings that have been promised to Abraham generations before, in Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, there's a continuation of the promise that God made even earlier than Abraham, back in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, at the fall of man, where God promised, speaking to the serpent, that from your seed, and then the capital seed, in essence, you're going to bite his heel, but he's going to crush your head. And so, a rule will come from Judah. And again, from the words we read in Genesis 49, that a rule will come from the tribe of Judah, who riding on a donkey will command the obedience of nations. That's what Israel spoke over his boy. That's crazy, man. So fast forward to the Gospel of John chapter 12. And there are 4 accounts of the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. And I love all of them. But for the sake of today, I'd like to just go to John chapter 12. Beginning in John 12, verse 12, it says, "The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival," and the festival is like the festival of Passover. In essence, there's this weekly celebration of Passover. Again, not coincidental. But everyone's coming in for one of the 3 big feasts, and this particular feast happened to be Passover. You could preach a message off that right there. But the next day the crowd had come for the festival. They heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And this is a glance back to Psalm 118, verses 25 and 26. "Blessed is the King of Israel." Verse 14, "Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written." And John's quoting from Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, and he says and writes these words. In other words, I'm linking a prophecy that was spoken or written 500 years ago, and I'm letting you know, here's the fulfillment of it. And it says this, verse 15. Again, these are words that a prophet had penned 500 years before Jesus steps on to the scene. "Do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt." Again, Zechariah had prophesied 500 years before Christ comes that the Messiah would come on a donkey as king. Just like Israel had prophesied to his son Judah. And he didn't say war horse, which is what the Jews were looking for, but on a donkey. And some think like sitting on a donkey, like that's got to be like a joke. No, in that day, Solomon, David's son, rode in on a donkey, because a donkey was also a form of royalty. So a donkey wasn't like a joke, but it was also a symbol of peace. And Solomon's reign was one of peace. In fact, Israel did not enjoy peace in the land under any other king as they did under Solomon. But Solomon rode into this same city on a colt as a king that would bring an era of peace that up to that time they had not seen. And so again, not just from the tribe of Judah, but even when God had made promise to David that there will be someone from your family line that will sit on the throne eternally. It keeps passing down, as just as David's son had rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Now, capital M Messiah rides in, not on a war horse to overthrow Rome, but on a donkey. And Jesus, here in Zechariah, is depicted as the humble shepherd king who comes to the holy city to take his rightful place. But it's not what they were looking for. And he still isn't today. Verse 16, as we continue John's account. Chapter 12, verse 16. At first, his disciples, so that's Jesus' disciples, did not understand all of this. As it's playing out before their very eyes, it says, verse 16, they did not understand all this. Only after Jesus was glorified. In other words, Jesus ascends back to heaven, or he's resurrected, and then from that time to him ascending to heaven, only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him, and that these things had been done to him, Jesus. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, went out to meet him. So there was already a ton of people, and there's different theologians. Some believe that there was 250,000 people in Jerusalem at the time. I've read accounts where many people believe there was about 1 million people in the area for Passover. And probably normally there was maybe 250,000 people that would come into Jerusalem 3 times a year for 3 different, what they would call like pilgrimage feasts, but where they would travel from wherever they lived to the holy city 3 times a year. But this particular time, not only was it Passover, which was the big deal, but this guy is raising people from the dead. And so you can imagine, as whatever Jerusalem was, it was overrun from its normal Passover week. And they just so happen to be here for the moment that Judah says will happen, Zechariah says will happen, and Jesus absolutely, unequivocally sets up. And his disciples, his own disciples, don't get it until after he'd been glorified. That means all the way through the cross, all the way through Holy Week, they're clueless. Like they don't have a clue as what they're actually seeing play out before their very eyes. So the timing of Jesus' triumphal entry, Passover week. The fact that he's entering Jerusalem, the city of David. The young colt that Jesus chooses to ride on. Not just an imagery of kingship, but a symbol of peace. The opposite of what the Jews were hoping him to be. The fact that he received the praises that were shouted out as he's entering into the holy city. And this is the first time, actually, where he receives it. Every other time, he's like, now's not time. But the fact that he's receiving the praises that the Messiah alone was only supposed to receive, and he receives them. Praises that he's the one, the Messiah, the Son of God. This is no coincidence. Jesus is being beyond obvious. And verse 16 just said that Jesus' own disciples missed what was actually even happening. So in this moment, again, God was making good on a series of promises. Even the allotment of land to the tribes play into his overall arching plan for him to bring a Messiah from one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And through that, making good on a promise that's made time and time again throughout the Old Testament. The whole Old Testament points and sets the stage for this moment, for this person. And just like he had made good on giving Israel the land as their inheritance, God, in this moment, as he goes into Jerusalem, is making good on the promise of a coming Messiah. But it was up to Israel what they did with their inheritance. I'm talking about Israel in the land of Canaan. And it was up to Israel what they did with their inheritance. I'm talking about the crowd receiving Jesus on a donkey. And so it is with us. If God says it, He will do it. But He invites us in for the component where we actually have to step in. The tribes had to step in to possess the land. Israel, or the Jews, had to figure out what they wanted to do or didn't want to do with this Messiah that's coming into the holy city. And so do we. In 2024, on Palm Sunday, what do we do? What do we do with these promises? Our part that He's graciously given to us. And if we aren't careful, we, like the disciples of Jesus' triumphal entry, we can miss the gravitas of what God is doing right in front of us. Especially when Jesus shows up as He is instead of the way that He's desired. Let me say that again. We can miss what God's doing in front of our very faces when He shows up the way He is as opposed to who we're hoping Him to be. And so, as I read the account from John, I think it fitting to end with a time of worship as a church family. And the reason is, again, this is the first time as Jesus is coming into the holy city where He doesn't like try to kind of bring things to a halt or like it's not time. He receives that worship. In fact, He's told, tell them to stop praising. And Jesus said, I tell you the truth. If they did not, the rocks would cry out. And so, Palm Sunday, although this crowd had no idea the gravitas of what was actually happening, we do. They didn't have a Gospel of John. We do. And we're on the other end of Christ's sacrifice. And so they had something to worship and to celebrate, but He hadn't gone to the cross yet. He has.